Okay, and we should be live now. I'm here with Louis Giliberto. Am I pronouncing that correctly?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Pleasure to finally meet you, sort of in person. I'm sure we can arrange an actual in-person physical meetup at some point, but us millennials have to do everything online first. So, we were introduced by our mutual friend Owialai, who said very good things about you, particularly with your background in philosophy, theology, and with Platonism. So I was hoping to get to know you a little bit better and maybe pick your brain about how you came to some of these views and to maybe explain some of the basics to me. It's been a few months since I was in an introductory philosophy class talking about Platonism.
Yeah, I guess I'll start. So I grew up Roman Catholic, and I'm 48 years old. And about year 2000, I became a traditional Roman Catholic, which means I go to the pre-Vatican II Latin Mass and so forth. And when studying theology, I came across, a lot of things, not just from Plato, but from Hermes Trismegistus, because in the medieval and Renaissance, they held what they call the noble pagans in a lot of respect. And that kind of died off in the Enlightenment. But even St. Augustine said, pay attention to the pagans where they tell the truth. And in reading the philosophy and starting with and the theology, starting with St. Thomas Aquinas and Albert the Great, they all refer to Plato and Aristotle. And so that's what made me interested in Platonism.
Yeah, I think it was Aristotle who was simply referred to as the philosopher by St. Thomas Aquinas, wasn't he?
Yes, he just calls him the philosopher.
Yeah. And it's interesting, the respect that was given to the pagans at that time. I remember reading Augustine, The City of God, and he had a kind of respect for the pagans of his day, too. He didn't agree with them, obviously, and he was a bit of a St. Christopher character. He had his meanderings through various other, I believe it was Manichaeanism, before he came back to the one true faith. And he held a kind of respect for some of the old Roman pagans, some more than others, of course. But that's, I think, sort of a difficult subject for many mainstream Christians to wrap their brains around, at least in the United States.
Yeah, well, I mean, St. Augustine, he was educated as a Neoplatonist. And I believe he was actually educated by a bishop in Neoplatonism. But there was a lot of crossover at that time because Neoplatonism had come to the point where it was almost monotheistic. Like Plotinus refers to the one, which is the monad, or a single. It's hard to describe, but it's like a single thing, and all the other gods in the pantheon emanate from that. And within Neoplatonism, they would argue how that would fit in and stuff. But so there's a lot of crossover then between Christianity and Neoplatonism, and they both disliked the Gnostics severely.
Yes.
So that happened. I think where things started to fall, so in Catholicism at least, where things started to fall out of favor for Plato was by the Scholastics. Even to this day, if you look up things about St. Thomas Aquinas, they talk about how he followed Aristotle. But actually, there's a lot of Plato in his writing, and his teacher, St. Albert, studied a lot of Plato as well. And I think part of that is because when the Enlightenment came around, scholasticism, that form of philosophy and argument, was a good antidote towards some of the secularism. Because obviously Plato's a lot more mystical. And I think he's actually more revered in the Byzantine rites, the eastern branches of the church, to be honest with you. So I think that's kind of how he fell out of favor a little bit.
Oh, okay. And you mentioned Gnosticism, which sort of touches on another subject I'd hope to get to with you at some point in the future, which is Thelema. But could you explain to me some of the basics of Gnosticism? I've had many friends play around the edges, and my dad sort of thinks he's into that as well, though that's mostly through the Dan Brown novels, not through serious study of the literature on it.
Well, there's different kinds, and it's been a while since I've read it. And actually, most of what we know about it before, like the Dead Sea Scrolls and stuff, was just what the church fathers wrote condemning it. So it's kind of a mishmash. But basically, they believe that let's see if I get this right. There's God, and from him came Sophia, wisdom. And Sophia sent a spark into the primordial ooze, and that created the demiurge. And the demiurge is the one that created the material universe. And he thinks he's God. And his trick is to trick people into worshiping him. And that's, there's all different kinds of areas around it, and that's kind of like the 30,000 foot level. But, that has all kinds of implications, such as matter is evil. And some of the Gnostic rites, such as the Endura, which was ritual starvation to escape this world. And the main thing that both the Platonists and the Christians disagreed with them on was that matter was evil.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, that seems like... well, we're getting interesting, weird parallels with that in modern times, I think, with some of these, particularly some of the ecological positions that basically holds humankind to be evil. You get this strain in some transhumanist lines of thought as well, though obviously from a more sort of secular justification. But that's interesting. So Gnosticism was anti-matter, as it were.
Yeah, that we're trapped in this physical universe, right? And we're supposed to get out of it. And people mistakenly worship this crazed God. It's almost like a Lovecraft story, right? This crazed being, the demiurge, thinks he's God because he created all this. And some of the, I want to say Sethian Gnostics, they referred to Sophia, wisdom, as a whore because she birthed this monster, basically. And then they have their own mythos about. They can go into some of the Christian Gnostics into the story of the Garden of Eden and how the serpent was sent there to try and save humanity from the demiurge, right? That he was actually the bringer of knowledge. And you find that in Luciferian religions as well, that the serpent was the good guy trying to enlighten human beings. So it starts branching off into all kinds of interesting areas of theology and mythology.
So it's almost... Gnosticism seems to be the basis of some of these sorts of left-hand path type groups, then.
There's some. I mean, yeah, they definitely, depending on the left-hand path group, right? But they definitely take things from different places. And when I've looked into historic esotericism, there's basically a couple of streams of it. One, of course, is Judaism. That's where you get more of the ritual magic and Kabbalah and stuff. But there's also the Gnostic stories that were passed down and so forth. And then the witchcraft falls more under like Diana and the Hellenic and Greek ones.
Yeah, that always seemed more pagan than Christian. I'm gradually growing familiar with some of the non-mainline religious views that accept what we can, I hope without offense, call Christian mythology. I mean that in the positive sense, not in the usual derisive sense. But,
right.
But don't have quite the same view of it that my Protestant family, for example, might. Going to
right.
a good mainline Methodist church, and Yahweh is, of course, the benevolent good person rather than the pretender deity.
Right, exactly. Yeah. So that's where Platonism and Christianity, Orthodox Christianity, agreed on was that matter was not evil.
So we could almost say that mainline Christianity is the Christian mythos plus Platonism. I think was it Nietzsche who called Christianity Platonism for the masses?
I'm not sure, but I would not necessarily disagree with that. Christianity, like the patrimony of Christianity has two patrimonies. It has the Jewish one, but it has the pagan one. Saint Paul was the apostle to the Gentiles, and the Gentiles were the Romans, and that's why when you look at the Roman Catholic Church, a lot of the practices, especially in the traditional Mass, come from pagan things. Pontifex, the pontiff is
Right.
the name of, and so on and so forth. So we have a patrimony.
Follow him at Pontifex on Twitter.
Yes, or don't follow him. He's not my favorite pope.
Or don't follow him. Benedict was an improvement.
Yes. Excuse me. So, that's the patrimony of Christianity as well. Is European paganism, especially Greek and Roman. In the Byzantine branches too, you see a lot of the Greek influence there.
Now, Greek would imply the inclusion of Aristotle with Plato. I'm a little bit more familiar with Aristotle than his philosophy than I am with Plato. But is that a big difference, or did Thomas Aquinas manage to really merge those things, Platonism and Aristotelianism?
So that's an interesting. Yeah, that's another one. People have been trying to reconcile those since forever. I was actually I've been studying some of the Plato stuff with Avi, and the Neoplatonists like Iamblichus, he tried really hard to reconcile Plato and Aristotle, and they actually studied Aristotle when he was teaching. And there's there's a kind of interesting difference. You could think of Plato as like a vertical, right? Heavenly and earthly, and Aristotle is more horizontal, like his philosophy more spans the sciences and categories and things that are around us. So I see them actually as complementary. Because of how I'm interested in philosophy, I tend to read Plato more.
Okay. So what we've ended up with then is a merging of the two in substance, whether or not that's philosophically satisfying for people like us.
Yeah, well, it's just like the things like the paganism that became the patrimony of Christianity, right? Along the way, things are picked up and integrated. It took Plato and Aristotle to make St. Thomas, and St. Thomas Aquinas inspired other people in scholasticism and so forth. So things are kind of that's how I view it. Things are kind of collected all the way, and someone finds a new way to apply them, and hopefully it's the right way.
Right, and now that's an interesting subject right there. This whole matter of Christianity sort of adopting outside views. It's a very common argument I hear some pagans making about sort of the falsehood or the hypocrisy or the emptiness of Christianity proper. Look, you're just bringing in other people's stuff. You're not really bringing your own views to the table. Have you run into that at all?
Yeah, and I can see their point, but I don't think it's correct. And I don't think it's correct for this reason. The people who became Christians were pagans who converted. And they brought their culture and teachings and clothing and rituals, especially like I've said, you could see in Orthodox Christianity, meaning Orthodox churches, like Greek Orthodox and in Roman Catholicism. You could see their influence there. It's just that when they converted, they brought things. St. Augustine was Manichaean, and when he converted, he brought Neoplatonism. You can see it pretty clearly in his writings when you look at it. So all those things were brought in by people who joined the church. They brought their best. If it wasn't a forced conversion, if they converted because they believed, certainly you're going to bring your best to the new God that you worship. And so they brought all these things, into the church, and that's also why you see a difference between the Byzantine rites and the Latin rites.
Yeah, I think the substance of the criticism is that doesn't that show that the the practices and beliefs of Christianity aren't essentially Christian, since they came from the people rather than from the outside. And the way that I've been thinking about it, at least for the time being, until I get a better answer, is that, you know, Christianity provides an essential core of the truth, but the manner in which that core of the truth is presented is going to vary based on who it's being presented to, because we don't all speak the same language, literally or narratively or metaphorically. I think Hitchens, of all people, had a story about a pastor teaching in one of the Southeast Asian islands. I want to say New Guinea, and it happened to be an island that had no sheep on it. And the natives he was preaching to didn't understand what sheep were, really. Now, there's a lot of pastoral analogies in the Bible, you know, the Good Shepherd and all that.
Mm-hmm.
And those didn't translate very well. So he referred to his flock as his swineherd.
I see.
to make the metaphor stick. And it sounds goofy, but, you know, it communicates the essential point. And the details used to convey the essential point aren't the point itself. One could, if you were being a real theological stickler, you could even say that is a form of idolatry. And that the essential truth can be communicated in different ways and can have additional elements based on differences between different people, because we're not all the same. You know, there are essential similarities, but that doesn't mean all of the, you know, we all have 2 arms, 2 legs, 2 eyes, a nose, and mouth, but we don't all prefer the same things in every instance. We don't all have the same tastes, the same artistic preferences and appetites and things of that kind.
Right. And yeah, I definitely agree with you. And part of that, you can also separate doctrine from discipline, right? Discipline being like maybe how you worship, what kind of music you use and stuff. You know, it's like, okay, we know that God is worshipped through song. It says so in the Bible, so that's scriptural.
Unless
but
you're
what kind of
witness?
Yes, exactly. But what kind of song? You know, in the Latin church you have Gregorian chant. In the Byzantine church you have different forms of Byzantine chant. There's you know, some of the things like the use of candles during Mass are left over from saying services in the catacombs, where candles were lit. There's this rich tradition and history that's been built up over time, right? It's not just one thing. And part of the problem also was, remember that, you know, obviously Jesus was Jewish, and the temple was destroyed, and that was the Jewish religion. That was their sacrificial priesthoods gone. So you couldn't carry on that form of worship anymore. So how did the form of worship carry on? And, you know, it's based on the Last Supper and the sacrifice on the cross and so on and so forth. So I don't think their criticism is, I don't take it as a negative criticism because they have a point, but I don't think their criticism is accurate as they intend it.
Right. It doesn't have the punch that they sort of expect it to have.
Right. And that's just through maybe not knowing the history of Christianity, and why some things are done a certain way. And that's fair. You know, I could see from the outside how it appears that way.
Well, speaking of traditions, one of the more interesting lines that, and this I think ties into some of the cultural battles across both secular and theological circles in politics these days, Pope Francis made an interesting comment where he said, I can't understand these youth's desire to be all traditional and to hold on to these old practices that seem not to be as relevant these days. And the question of traditionalism seems to be one of the bigger rising points in both politics and in theology these days. What's your take on that?
Oh boy, just within Catholicism, you know, you could write several books on it. So let me do a little bit about Catholicism and then expand into politics. So the Catholic Church had the same Mass and everything basically unchanged from the 1500s to 1968, where they did things at the Second Vatican Council.
You know,
And actually, the
you could write
Mass goes
several
back a
books.
lot farther than that, but that was the last time they basically issued a major canonical reform, was from the Council of Trent. And so what happened there, there's various books you could read on it, but they wanted to basically modernize the church. And so they allowed Mass to be said in the local language instead of Latin, and they changed the wordings of the Mass and so on and so forth. But what I found, and that's the church I grew up in, is the post 1968 church. I went to Catholic school and everything before I went to traditionalism. And what happens is you start to realize those things that have been added on traditionally over 1,500 years are there for a reason, especially if you're talking about liturgy or ritual. You have 1,500 years of development in something that helps a person focus towards the intended end, which is prayer towards God or being a prayerful mindset. And then people modernized it. You saw that through the 60s, like this huge upheaval in culture where anything of any traditional value was discarded. And it was done for various reasons, but the end result seems to be the same. Now, one of the problems that came out of Vatican II was what happened to the Jesuits, the Society of Jesus. And I was actually educated by them for 10 years. So I have a lot of experience with Jesuits. They basically are the ones that developed liberation theology, which is right. It's Marxism. It's Marxism under the guise of Christianity. In fact, I can recommend a book if anyone wants to read in depth about it. There's a book called The Jesuits, and it's by Malachi Martin. He was a Jesuit priest. And he goes through it in great detail, but basically that's what Pope Francis is. He has that kind of Marxist mindset, and that's why he can't understand, some of this love of tradition, because from the love of tradition, right, comes things like an appreciation for monarchy.
Yeah, that comment you made that, it looks like these things that were in place were here for a reason. It seems to be one that a lot of people are in our generation. Oh, I suppose our generation and the upcoming Generation Z or Zyklon, depending on who you are realizing too. I remember back in my atheist days hearing, the likes of Hitchens and Matt Dillahunty juxtapose reason, and Douglas Murray for that matter too, reason with revelation. But it seems that the better juxtaposition is reason with tradition, and they're really different epistemologies. And revelation is only the sort of superficial trappings of beliefs that we have adopted and attitudes and behaviors that we don't necessarily understand how they work, but we know that they do work in an almost Darwinian fashion because they've proved effective. And it's the more humble position to take, in my opinion, because you don't need to understand why, how electrons move to make a light bulb illuminate a room in order to flip on the light switch. I think as Vox Day analogized it in his debate book on the subject. And that traditional epistemology versus the rational epistemology, I expect that to be a big schism in the culture conflict in the upcoming years.
I agree with what you're saying, because I see the same thing too. And in Catholicism it's a little different. It's reason and faith. And actually, interestingly, that's why they considered someone like Plato a noble pagan. Was Plato got to know God as far as possible through reason alone. And he didn't have divine revelation, right? So he did the best he could. So that's another reason they honor him. But I don't think tradition and reason will oppose or be orthogonal to each other. I think if you apply reason, you value tradition for the same reason that Vox Day said. It's reasonable. It's an act of reason to use something that works, right? And
is it an act of reason or is it an act of faith?
Well, it's an act of reason to choose something that works. It's a conscious decision that you're going to pick something that works. Now, it's an act of faith when you're asked how it works. You're like, I don't know. But we do that all the time. I mean, half the drugs the pharmaceutical companies come out with, they don't know the exact mechanism. They just know that it works. Um,
True.
so, but the thing is I look at you. You talked about, like, I think you said a humble position, and I agree. I look with humility at, human beings don't change, really. We really don't. Our behaviors and stuff. So I could read Plato, who's 2,000 something years old, and what he wrote back then applies today because it's about human beings. And so when he says things like, you should learn the four cardinal virtues, fortitude, prudence, justice, and temperance, they're going to apply to a human being today the same way they did back then. And those were lessons that were hard learned by all humanity, like what's important, right? What's important for humans to get along? What's important for humans to survive? And all those lessons were hard learned and passed down. And that's the value of tradition, is we take what came before us and we build upon it. And people who just eject tradition because it seems old or whatever, they're those people that are doomed to repeat history because they don't know history, but in a worse way. They're ignoring, lessons that humankind learned over thousands of years, that are important lessons, and that's how I see it. And so I read Plato and stuff with humility because it's as relevant. I don't think of him as an old guy. I think of him as relevant today as then, because human beings are, behave the same.
Absolutely, I agree with all of that, and I think in addition, one of my favorite philosophers alive today is a guy named Matthew Crawford. He's written a couple of phenomenal books. One of them called The World Beyond Your Head. He's describing how to perhaps we can get our minds around resolving the crisis of attention we've gotten into. And he has a line in there about traditions of work and craft, whether it's making pipe organs or repairing motorcycles. They're bodies of collective wisdom and knowledge and skill that are handed down through the generations. And rejecting these things, he has a line in there where he says it commits the sin, and this is a secular author, I believe anyways, talking about the sin of ungratefulness in rejecting these things. And when you think back to the amount of sacrifices that people throughout history have made for the benefits of their posterity, not thinking that they would get anything out of it necessarily themselves, then it becomes an extraordinarily ungrateful thing to reject the traditions that they have, people have bled to and toiled their entire lives away in order to maybe to fail, maybe to only find something that didn't work, and that we've inherited, and now we're just going to toss that away because, well, we can't understand it, so we're going to start afresh. It's an extraordinarily arrogant and ungrateful thing to do, and it's one that will likely doom you to wasting a lot of energy in life.
Oh, absolutely. And I think it dooms humanity, right? Because a lot of those lessons are lessons of survival. And it's interesting when you talked about how they may not do it for themselves, but for future generations. The first thing that came to my mind is some of the cathedrals in Europe, where the people who designed them and started building them died long before they were finished. But they believed they were making something, to benefit humanity, and that would last a long time. But it's true, and that goes to the trades you're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the Freemasons immediately popped to mind, but I think all of the trades, and I would include a lot of other jobs and roles, even if they're not careers or paid jobs, like being a father, for example, or
Right.
being a brother. There are traditions of wisdom and knowledge about how I can best fulfill that role. And if I try to restart the intellectual clock on that and start from scratch, I mean, just from the role of parent, you can already see the dramatic amount of harm that could come from that solipsistic arrogance. Thankfully, an instinct against that seems to be pretty hardwired into us. Only scientists seem to have the guts to to mess around with that, especially the behaviorists.
Yeah, and I mean, when you look at human history, and there's been a couple of instances where humanity barely survived, right? Like maybe barely is an exaggeration, but like during the Black Plague, and lessons were learned there the hard way, and maybe they thought it was miasma instead of germs, but they learned certain behaviors that allowed humanity to survive, and we would ignore them at our peril. Now we have scientific reason to do some of those things, but it's a similar thing as some of these lessons were learned at great risk by all humanity, and we'd be well to follow them. Now that doesn't mean don't ask a question. I ask questions all the time, but to approach it with the kind of reverence that first assume that they knew something. And I don't, and I want to figure out what they learned, and then ask questions about it.
Yeah, and to not dismiss an old revered thinker as stupid or idiotic just because you can't understand it. I remember watching The Amazing Atheist, T.J. Kirk, do a video on Thomas Aquinas, and he said it was like 10 reasons. It was like a listicle video, basically. It's like 10 reasons why Thomas Aquinas is a total idiot. And you're just left, and he offers some arguments why some of the Thomas Aquinas' arguments don't quite hold out, and just as an objective viewer who isn't familiar really with either side, the viewer might think, okay, I can see where you're going here, but do you really think one of the most revered thinkers in all of the Western tradition, revered by people far smarter than either of us, is an idiot? Are you that certain of yourself?
Right.
And there's no, it's a sort of a disrespect for your adversary that I find. The more I've studied tradition, the more I realized how wrong I was when I was absolutely correct in my early 20s. The harder that sort of excessive confidence is to stomach for me.
Oh, absolutely. And I find every year, the more I read or study even the same books, the more humble I am by, especially given what they had to work with. People also forget that, Aquinas made mistakes that have been analyzed now, but that was hundreds of years ago. And he was building on, what Aristotle had built, who had built on what Plato had built, who had built on Socrates and so forth. It's like, if we look at someone that got something wrong in the past and laughed just because the stuff hadn't been developed yet, then that's a problem with us, right? We should appreciate the hard work that was done, we talked about. So that's one of the things. That's one of the reasons I'm a conservative and a traditionalist is because of Western culture and European civilization and how much it has done for humanity specifically, and that's why you'll find me making arguments for the preservation of it now. Yeah. There's other successful cultures, right, like the Chinese, and they're different, but in most of the world it's been Western culture and European culture that has helped human beings survive, and in the current climate now, that's exactly what they want to overthrow. They want to erase everything. And replace it with I'm not even sure what, to be honest with you, and so that's one of the things that bothers me. Besides, the intellectuals who dismiss it, is that they want to destroy Western culture when that's what got humanity to where we are today.
Right, and I'm even at the point where even if Chinese culture was somehow objectively better than the Western traditions that we've inherited, I would still be for the Western traditions simply because they're mine. They're ours,
exactly.
Rather.
Yes.
And they're worth preserving intrinsically based on the different preferences we have than the Chinese or the Africans or the Congolese or whoever else might have traditions of their own that are intrinsically worth preserving for them. And this seems like a good sort of transition point from a little bit of theology into politics, because there's a lot of talk about preserving Western civilization these days, but there's markedly different approaches in the pursuit of accomplishing that goal, and to some degree divergent views of what Western civilization essentially is. You can see this in the division between the alt-right and so-called alt-light.
Right.
Have you been following that very closely?
Enough. I mean, I don't read, the news feeds on it every day, but I definitely know what some of the differences between the alt-light and the alt-right are. I think one of the things I see, so I'm a conservative and I'm on the right, and I classify myself as like a paleo-conservative more than anything. But one of the things I see is there's not a clear, consistent knowledge of what tradition is on the right, and I think a lot of it is there's yourself, and I know some of your friends that you associate with, and you guys are all, I admire you guys. You're young and you're intelligent, inquisitive, and intellectual, and you look into things. But the majority of people in the alt-light and the alt-right aren't like that, and a lot of times what they think is tradition is more of a fantasy. It's more of a fantasy land, and honestly, it's like you'll see them, they'll know about, all this anime, right? And I watch anime too. And I play video games and all that, but they'll know like this whole history of anime. But then you ask them, name some silent films, or name, German cinematography, Impressionist period, or this, and they don't know anything about their own culture yet. They say they're fighting for traditionalism. You can ask them, well, what do you believe in honor and stuff? And they'll say, yeah. And well, where does that come from? And they don't know what the 4 cardinal virtues are.
I don't think I could name silent films or anime. I don't know if that's good or bad.
It's neither or both, right? The point is if you're fighting for tradition and culture, you should know what you're fighting for, right? Like there's this recent blow up.
Absolutely.
Yeah, there's this recent blow up about like Lauren Southern and such, and people attacking and stuff, and I got in a couple of discussions online, and the thing, people say, well, these guys are white knighting, and I'm like, well, if you look at tradition, men didn't attack women. It wasn't done. If you had a problem with a woman, you went to her father or brother, or if she was married to her husband. You didn't confront a woman, and if you did, you would get treed. Your own family would take you, tie you to a tree, and beat you, because that was not appropriate. Now these same guys like the tradition where their wife will make them dinner and stuff, which is tradition too. But you can't pick and choose, because those two things actually feed off of each other, right? I mean, if you have a wife that makes you dinner, she's depending on you to protect her.
Right. Well, this sort of highlights the problem that Jordan Peterson was bringing up with Camille Paglia a few months back. Here's the direct quote here. This is Jordan Peterson speaking. He says, "Here's the problem. I know how to stand up to a man who's unfairly trespassed against me. And the reason I know that is because the parameters for my resistance are quite well defined, which is, we talk, we argue, we push, and then it becomes physical. If we move beyond the boundaries of civil discourse, we know what the next step is. That's forbidden in discourse with women. So I don't think men can control crazy women. I really don't believe it. I think they have to throw their hands up in, it's not even disbelief, there's no step forward that you can take under those circumstances. Because if the man is offensive enough and crazy enough, the reaction becomes physical right away. Or at least the threat is there. And when men are talking to each other in any serious manner, that underlying threat of physicality is always there, especially if it's a real conversation, and it keeps the thing civilized to some degree. If you're talking to a man who wouldn't fight with you under any circumstances whatsoever, then you're talking to someone to whom you have absolutely no respect. But I can't see any way. For example, there's a woman in Toronto who's been organizing this movement against me and some other people who are going to do a free speech event, and she managed to organize quite effectively, and she's quite offensive, you might say. She compared us to Nazis, for example, publicly, using the swastika, which wasn't really something I was all that fond of. But I'm defenseless against that kind of female insanity, because the techniques that I would use against a man who is employing those tactics are forbidden to me. That's the end of the quote that I had written down. But I think that's one of the things that the genuine misogynists in the alt-right are like trying to put their finger on. And Jordan Peterson is, of course, much more nuanced about it, and he thinks that, and I am there with him, that bringing in women to deal with other women is the best answer that we can have. I don't think kicking women out of the movement is practical or moral, in my opinion. I'm open to counter arguments, but that's just my perception of the where that whole argument was coming from.
Oh, no, I mean, I agree. What I would say with Jordan Peterson is, well, you have to develop new tactics then. If your enemy's changed form, you can't sit there and complain that the enemy's doing something different. You develop new tactics. And one tactic,
Right,
like you mentioned, is to bring women in to argue with them so they're on the same kind of playing field. And that was, I mean, interestingly, I think you remember Gamergate, right?
Oh, yes.
So Not Your Shield was that, because they were
Yeah.
playing identity politics, and people who were gamers said, no, I'm a person of color, I'm a female, and they went to war with them to remove that. And that was Milo's whole thing too, right? Because
Exactly.
since he's gay, he could say things about feminism that a normal man couldn't, because it removed that tone of sexuality that was there.
Yeah, which is the sort of doubly stupid part of attacking, traditionalist, conservative-leaning women. Though, from what I've heard, a lot of these attacks seem to have been coordinated by provocateurs from the other side, who are concern trolling and pretending to be offensive right-wing radicals, essentially, but aren't, or leftists or SJWs trying to organize this, and both sides are doing this,
Right.
Um,
And that's the magic of it. You never know where these things come from, right?
yeah. But I think for me personally, that just highlights the importance of not accepting this whole "don't punch right" bad meme that was going around, because how do you know that they're genuinely on the right? How do you know that they're not some Poe trying to take you for a ride and stir up a storm for their own benefit?
Oh, absolutely. I was reading. Avi asked me to read, and it was interesting. Greg Johnson wrote an article called "Don't Let the Bastards Get You Down."
Yeah, I sent that to her.
Oh, okay.
Greg
Well,
is
thank you, because
fantastic.
it made it to me. Um, and he said,
Oh, good.
I don't have it exactly in front of me, but he said something along the lines like, "We can't throw the bad people out," and that's not true. You can throw the bad people out. You saw it happen in Gamergate. As soon as someone went too far outside a general consensus, they were denounced. And I'm not saying that we should, is that people should, start infighting like that. But when someone does something that's outside of an acceptable consensus of a movement, the movement should throw them out.
Yeah. Well, and that's actually something that Greg Johnson in particular has been doing or attempting to do with Daniel Freiberg, and to a slightly lesser degree Richard Spencer. Now, Richard Spencer has a lot of sway in those circles. I think unjustly. He's, a bit of a drunken jerk that no one seems to like, and he's just a bit of a hurricane that travels around the country and leaves a wake of destruction wherever he goes. Daniel Freiberg is a little bit worse.
Hmm.
He seems to there are allegations of fraud and embezzlement and I don't know the details on it. I don't want to necessarily say anything, but there are people who in any movement, whether it's the right or the far left, or within Christianity, who, if you are genuine in your beliefs on these sorts of things, you shouldn't tolerate these people tarnishing your name, because it'll hurt you by association. And it's one of the lessons that I've learned, is that believing the same things is not enough, and that I would much rather have a leftist atheist who is at least honorable and cares about integrity and being truthful and being consistent, than someone who ostensibly believes all the same things that I do but doesn't necessarily do it seriously, because they can be a liability.
Right, and when you look at it, they don't really believe the same things that you do if their behavior is such that it's the opposite. And like I look at some of the leaders, I look at some of the leaders in both the alt-right and the alt-right, and by my estimation, these guys shouldn't be leaders. And my rule of thumb is, I would not follow someone I wouldn't trust to babysit my kids. And when I look at some of these guys, there are some that I definitely would not allow to babysit my kids. I'm not saying they're child molesters, but they're just irresponsible, or they set a bad example, and that concerns me. And that goes back to, like, we were talking about theology and philosophy. Like, one thing I tell Avi, that I say, what I hope you do is corrupt the youth with virtue, just like Socrates did. That a lot of these young men and women, they grew up in public schools. They grew up in the shit tier culture we have, and they really do need to learn virtuous behavior. They need to learn what honor and discipline mean, instead of being a mob of rabble. And I think that, like, for someone my age, it's my responsibility to try and set a good example. And for gentlemen such as yourself and some of your friends, I'm hoping that you guys, pull some of your peers or slightly youngers along and be like, look, you can't behave like this. If you want to get something done, you have to have some discipline. You have to have some knowledge. You have to be able to understand, you need the tools to understand what's right from wrong. And because of the lack of religion and because of media, people don't get that anymore. And so I think that that's one of the things that causes problems, and that's one of the reasons we find people following leaders that maybe they shouldn't follow.
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel like it's left my generation and the subsequent one with a hunger for that virtue that you're talking about. I think it's one of the reasons why Jordan Peterson is so, to borrow your analogy, so contagious. He's really scratching an itch that people haven't been able to get to in this culture that we have at the moment. And I suspect that's why the Canadian government and powers that be are trying so hard but so carefully to crack down on him without really appearing to do so. He's not good for their financial bottom line, or at least for many people's financial bottom lines.
Oh, right. And the powers that be out there want to destroy things like honor and morality, because people are more easily manipulated if they're not grounded in something.
Yeah, Jack Donovan had a great speech that he gave at NPI, of all places, speaking of Richard Spencer, a few years back, where he was talking about the what was the movie called, where you had the expansion of the nothing, the never-ending story.
Okay.
And the werewolf is explaining to the protagonist that the creators of the nothing want a world without dreams, because a world without dreams makes people easier to control. It makes them easier to manipulate and get them to buy your stuff and work for you and whatever else.
Yeah, absolutely, because that's all you know. You can't see past the checkout line or your next Nintendo game or whatever. You don't reach for anything higher, and that's one of the reasons. Another reason why I like Plato. Plato said philosophy begins with wonder, right? And dreams are wonder. And if you don't have those, you're not going to think. You're just gonna act on instinct.
Yeah, and that's that. But it's curious now that our instinct has brought us back to hungering and thirsting for the wisdom that our parents' generation seemed to have rejected, presumably because it was boring. But
Right. See,
go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say I'm a little different because I'm older, so I'm Gen X. But also, my parents were older when I was born, and my dad was from the World War II generation.
Oh, so you
So
skipped the baby
I
boomer
did,
generation entirely.
I did, yes. So
Good for you.
that's part. Thank you. I do consider myself blessed for that because I see, other people who haven't, and what a wreck it was. And it's just, if I had one piece of advice for the younger people listening is, look at, if you're a traditionalist and you want to look at Western civilization, go to where it was built, right? Like Nietzsche is fine, right? But it wasn't built on Nietzsche. It was built on Plato. It was built on Aristotle. It was built on Greek mythology and Roman mythology. I have friends that are Hellenistic pagans, and they're wonderful people. I adore them, and I share a patrimony with them.
Mm-hmm.
And they believe a lot of the same things I believe because culturally, right, the pagan mythology and the Christian teaching complement each other. So for the young people, go to how your civilization was built if you want to save and continue that civilization. I don't mean stay in Plato forever, but you should have a grounding and understand what your culture is and where it came from. And I didn't realize that. So when I was in high school and stuff, I was like 100% STEM. They didn't even call it STEM then. All I wanted to do was engineering, math, engineering. And then when I got to college and I started taking college level humanities courses, I realized how important it was to know history and philosophy and other things. So if you haven't had the opportunity of an education, libraries are free. Just walk in, pick up a book. It's important to be balanced, and that was Plato also. He didn't want people just studying philosophy. He told them to exercise. But it's important, I think, that if you're going to fight for tradition and Western culture and Western civilization, you have a knowledge of it, and you benefit from the lessons that you're fighting for. I mean, you are fighting for something, so you should take the benefit of those as well.
Well, fantastic. We've been going for about an hour. Let's close off with some book recommendations. I, of course, talked about Plato, but do you have any other suggestions that people should get started on if they want to do that, if they want to follow the traditionalist route and get to know their background?
Oh, sure. I mean, they're mostly classics, right? Like I like things that read as stories mainly. So I like the Plato's dialogues.
Oh, those are fantastic. Yeah, nothing better than a bunch of drunken guys getting together to complain about how horrendous they were trashed the night before.
Yeah, the symposium, they're drunk and talking about love. Yep. The Odyssey, the Iliad. Saint Augustine.
Iliad person.
Are you? Saint Augustine, City of God, and his Confessions. Let's see, what else do I like? For it, kind of religious, but not so much, there's a book called The Spiritual Combat, and it's about how to basically how to behave, how to be disciplined and behave, and act virtuously. Another Christian book I like is The Imitation of Christ by Thomas à Kempis. Let's see. Those are kind of like, that's kind of like where I would start. I would start probably like there, and also on YouTube, there's a couple of YouTube channels that do great jobs of explaining philosophy, because sometimes it can be hard. Like for the longest time, I couldn't picture Plato's cave in my head till I actually saw a film strip on it in school. So you can look on YouTube, and there's a bunch of channels that do those things. But really anything that inspires a person, if you like, stories of heroes, read Greek and Roman mythology. If you're Scandinavian, read Scandinavian mythology. All that stuff is there. It survived for a reason, and we're making a big mistake by not paying attention to it. And I think everyone can learn something from all of that.
Absolutely. Yeah, the joke I was alluding to, well, it's not really a joke, it's more of an observation from a classicist, is that there seemed to be uh, within the classics, people who like the Iliad and people who like the Odyssey, and rarely are there people who like both. And
Right.
for me, that was it. It struck a chord with me in the political realm, because unlike, there are other analogs between the left and the right. I think that the Iliad represents the philosophy of the left, actually, and the Odyssey of the right, and I have my reasons for that. But the fact that they were both written by the same person, I think, speaks volumes to their mutual necessity. We need both, not just one or the other.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, it's been an absolute pleasure talking with you, Luis, and I'm sure we will do some more in the future, maybe talking about Thelema as a follow-up to some other discussions that we've had. And look forward to talking with you again in the future.
All right. Thanks a lot, Christopher. I'm happy to be here, and it's always interesting reading your stuff and talking to you. And obviously, I'm going to keep following your writing.
Oh, thanks so much. The feeling is mutual.